Well, when President Trump says that Iran is in a place of unconditional surrender, he's not claiming the Iranian regime is going to come out and say that themselves. What the president means is that Iran's threats will no longer be backed by a ballistic missile arsenal that protects them from building a nuclear bomb in their country. President Trump will determine when Iran is in a place of unconditional surrender, when they no longer pose a credible and direct threat to the United States of America and our allies.
White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt with that explanation of unconditional surrender. Let's bring in former National Security Advisor under President Biden, Jake Sullivan. He's the co-host of the Vox Media podcast, The Long Game. It's great to have you back on the show. We heard from Senator Blumenthal earlier about his concern about boots on the ground in Iran. What are the options on the table here and your biggest concerns moving forward?
Well, I'll start with my biggest concern moving forward, and it's just the sheer lack of planning and thinking through all of the second and third order consequences here, as you guys were just discussing a minute ago. Mika, when you sit in the Situation Room before the president decides to send U.S. men and women into harm's way in war, you have to answer two questions. The first question is, what are our objectives? What are we trying to achieve, and can we align our means to those ends? We've gotten 12 different answers to the question of what our objectives are in this war. And so we're sitting here today, many days into this war, and we can't answer the question because the Trump administration can't answer the question. The second question you ask in the Situation Room is, what is our enemy going to do in response to our attack? And then you game out how you counteract it. And one of the things that was very obvious from the outset here is that Iran would threaten the Straits of Hormuz, shutting down energy supply to the world, trying to drive up gas prices for ordinary Americans and energy prices for people around the world. And yet here, nearly 2 weeks into the war, we seem befuddled by the fact that they have done that, and we have no answers for how to respond to it. So from my perspective, part of the reason that you have Karoline Leavitt playing word games about unconditional surrender, meaning kind of the opposite of what unconditional surrender actually means, is because we backed ourselves into a corner. We didn't have a clear answer to the question, what constitutes success in this war, when we went into it. And so now we don't know how to get out of it. And that has put U.S. military forces who have performed remarkably in this operation in a very difficult position.
All right, so Jake, let's talk about what you would do if you were in the position right now to get them out of that difficult position. And also, if you will, obviously, we understand we've all shared real concerns about how we went in there. First of all, I want you to just tell people that are watching in the Morning Joe family, what is the positive side as we move forward if the White House figures out how to land this, having Iran with a seriously degraded nuclear weapon system, seriously degraded ballistic missile system, which threatened our allies across the region, their military structure, their Navy, their Air Force, all really blown to pieces. Talk about how that could possibly make the region safer if we figure out how to land this operation without tremendous blowback. That's question number one. Question number two is, how do we do that? I know it's very difficult, but if you're there sitting with the president this morning, what are the steps that you take to move this to a position where Iran will agree to certain things that will allow our troops to come home?
Well, Joe, as you know, it's been a bipartisan commitment of multiple American presidents, going back to President Bush, President Obama, President Trump in his first term, President Biden, to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Now, the method that President Obama selected was to enter into a nuclear deal, to do it through diplomacy. President Trump has chosen to try to do it by military force. And last year, in Operation Midnight Hammer, it is the case that military force set Iran's nuclear program back substantially by destroying some of those significant nuclear facilities. But Iran still retains highly enriched uranium. It still retains centrifuges, and it still retains the scientists that could eventually build a bomb if Iran chose to do so. And what's been interesting in this iteration of the conflict, this war that was launched a week ago Saturday, is they really haven't gone back at those nuclear facilities. And I don't fully understand why that is, unless one of the ways in which they're going to try to advance the ball in degrading Iran's nuclear program is actually a special operation to try to go in on the ground to do something there. And we've seen that floated in the press, somewhat surprisingly, because you wouldn't think that people would be talking about that out in the open. That is an incredibly risky operation with no guarantee of success. And even then, to a point Richard Haass made a few minutes ago, Iran will retain the capacity to reconstitute a lot of these capabilities. So it is absolutely the case that the U.S. military, in really remarkable and quite professional fashion, has been able to action targets against ballistic missiles, against drones, against the Navy, against the armed forces of Iran. And Iran's capabilities, conventional capabilities, have been deeply set back. But at the end of this, you have to ask the question, where would we be a year from now or 2 years from now as Iran tries to build back up? And I think that's the strategic conundrum that the administration is facing. And it raises the question, is the ultimate endgame here regime change, as Lindsey Graham has argued? And I think that the history of U.S. engaging in regime change wars in the Middle East has not gone particularly well. So what I would be advising is to say it's time to take an off-ramp here, time to get out of this war, to say basically, look, we've achieved some operational tactical objectives, and now we need to limit the potential consequences of having this turn into an open-ended regime change war that drags the U.S. deeper and deeper in.
And by the way, some Republican senators were saying that yesterday. Declare victory, walk away. You've degraded their missile capability, just get out, which I don't think President Trump is prepared to do at this moment. Jake, let me ask you about the nuclear program. You mentioned it. There have been some reporting that maybe a special operations mission would go in. General Hertling was here yesterday explaining just how difficult that would be. This is not the Maduro raid. This is going in with equipment and force protection and everything else and digging up and extracting nuclear material. But as someone who addressed the nuclear problem with Iran with diplomacy during your time in the administration previous, what do you think the approach should be to denying, as we heard yesterday from Secretary Hegseth, the third objective he laid out, denying Iran access to a nuclear weapon? Given where we are right now, what's the best way forward in that direction?
Well, I still believe that there is the possibility of, through a hard-nosed diplomatic negotiation, addressing that stockpile. In fact, before the U.S. and Israel launched this war, the reports are that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner received an offer from the Iranians actually to do something about disposing of that material, which I think is the highest priority when it comes to abating the Iranian nuclear threat. We've got to either dilute that material so it cannot be easily enriched into weapons-grade uranium, or it has to be removed from the country. And I still believe that even after this war, even with all of the consequences of this, there remains a potential pathway to do that. I think it's more difficult now because Iran is going to be far more reluctant to go back to the table again after 2 rounds of military action. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the only way to have real confidence long term that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon is to have some form of diplomacy, because we need inspectors on the ground in Iran. We need Iran to agree to allow those inspectors in, because without that ability to verify, we simply can't be certain about what Iran is up to with its nuclear program. So my view would be basically say we've achieved substantial degradation of Iran's capabilities across the board. We are now going to end military hostilities here. To Richard's point, Iran has a vote in that too, and so does Israel. But then try to turn to a circumstance where we rally the countries of the world to say, now we need to deal diplomatically with Iran's nuclear program. I think we've put a massive hurdle in our way to try to do that now, because the enthusiasm of Iran to engage in such negotiations is probably at an all-time low following this action.
Jake, can I ask a question that Joe asked just a little differently, and that's to lay out the downside of the operation so far? Because if I'm hearing you right, you actually think that quite a lot of what has been done in terms of degrading Iran's military capability has been successful and has made the region safer. So was there a reason not to do this? Are there knock-on consequences, whether it's regional or a little further afield in terms of the implications for Russia or other countries, are there ways in which this operation of the last 10 days has made America not safer?
Well, Katie, I'm glad you asked the question because it gives me the opportunity to say I do not believe that this has made America safer. And I don't think that those tactical gains are actually going to convert into long-term security gains for the United States, not by a long shot. Joe asked me to kind of gamely make the positive case, and I think the most positive thing you can say is we made some tactical operational gains because we have a very effective military. I think strategically, this has so far been a huge setback for the United States because all of the advances, we've made no advances in this war on the nuclear program, as I've said, and the advances we've made on their conventional capabilities can be reversed relatively rapidly by Iran reconstituting its ballistic missile program and its drone program. So I think it's incremental on the gain side, and it's significant on the cost side. It's a cost, I think, in terms of strain in our relationships across the Gulf as they deal with the incoming from Iran. It's a cost in terms of our capacity to shape events globally because we're mired down in the Middle East right now. And also, we've chose to just launch a war of choice with no imminent threat. And I think that degrades America's overall capacity for global leadership. And finally, it raises the specter of potential asymmetric attacks from Iran, whether through terrorism or cyber or other means, that could potentially put more Americans at risk. So I think the net of all of this, especially since we've done this without any kind of explanation to the American people or with their informed consent, and we've done it without a clear and imminent threat facing us, is quite negative and getting more negative by the day. And that not even touching the economic consequences that are being felt by Americans as we speak at the pump. So I do think it is right to credit our armed forces for the work that they are doing. I think it's right to ask the question, what could we be getting out of this? But I think when you do a net assessment of this military action so far, it's very difficult to come out on the side that this is advancing America's national security interests.
Jake, it's Richard. We are where we are, and we can have long conversations about the errors that were made in getting us here. And if you assume that we can't base a policy on a hope for regime change, and that more military attacks won't solve the problems for us, also, you end up in diplomacy. So let me ask you two questions about diplomacy if you were advising a president. Would you simply have a nuclear-focused diplomacy, and should we put aside Iran's support, say, for proxies, ballistic missiles, whatever? Should we essentially have a nuclear approach? And second of all, do we now have to think about going back to where we were before the war, sanctions relief? Essentially, if we want this war to end, do we now have to be willing to put on the table incentives for Iran and not just simply threats?
So I'll start with the second question first. When you engage in diplomacy, even with your most implacable adversary, and you make a demand of them and you say, do this and I will give you nothing for it, the odds that they're going to say, okay, sure, I'll go along with that are quite low, even in the face of a military threat. So I think any diplomacy with Iran will have to involve a quid for the quo, will have to involve some measure of sanctions relief. Now, that can be metered, it can be tied to performance metrics, but I think it is not logical to think we could have a diplomatic deal that didn't involve the U.S. engaging in some form of sanctions relief. I think that has been true in diplomacy since time immemorial. On the first question, I would sequence this. I think asking for everything up front, saying we'll only do a deal if you give us missiles, if you give us terrorist proxies, and if you give us nuclear, is a recipe for hitting a dead end. So I would deal with the most proximate and considerable threat, which is the nuclear program. Get a deal on that. Get that enriched uranium out of Iran or get it diluted so it doesn't pose a threat. And then say that is a step along a path where we are also going to ask you, alongside the countries of the region, to enter talks about these bigger security issues, including missiles and terrorist proxies. I think sensible, practical diplomacy, step by step, can do more to help enhance the security of our people and people around the world than taking either a totally maximalist position that will hit a dead end in diplomacy or just up and choosing to launch a war of choice, which is what we've chosen to do.
Yeah, former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. And you can listen to Jake on his Vox Media podcast. the long game. We appreciate it.
And Richard, to the point that Iran gets a vote in this as well, the lead of Wide World of News, Mark Halperin's newsletter this morning that just came out, said despite questions about the health and viability of the supreme leader, Iran, quote, is not acting like a decapitated regime with massive Wednesday strikes into Tel Aviv, threats to mine the straits, a big hit on a U.S. facility in Iraq, wide-ranging hits on other American assets. Per the Associated Press, Iran attacked commercial ships on Wednesday across the Persian Gulf and targeted Dubai International Airport, escalating a campaign of squeezing the energy-rich region. 2 Iranian drones hit near Dubai International Airport, home to the long-haul carrier Emirates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Iran's Joint Military Command also announced it would start targeting banks and financial institutions in the Middle East, which would put, of course, Dubai at risk, on and on and on. That's just in the last 12 hours. So we are seeing last night an acceleration of U.S. targets in Tehran. But as Mark reports here, scouring the news from the region, Iran is striking back, and they do not look like a decapitated regime.
No, they're resilient. And what this tells us, Joe, is the 2 things we focused on most, regime change and military force, are not going to solve this for us. They're certainly not going to end it for us on terms we want. So we're going to end up, what Jake was just talking about, we're going to have to rethink diplomacy. And ironically enough, the exact issues that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner rejected talking about in any reasonable way before the war, we're going to have to circle back to exactly those issues. What are we prepared to tolerate or not on the nuclear file? What are we prepared to do in the way of sanctions, so forth? We are going to have to reach some understanding or accommodation with Iran because we cannot eliminate their military prowess, and we can't get the leadership in place that we want. We can't base U.S. policy on that hope. We actually need to have a strategy, and negotiations are going to have to be part of that strategy, as awkward and as difficult as that's going to be.
Maybe